From 1792 through 1800, more than 400 enslaved men, women, and kids constructed the structure that would turn into the most famous building in America. Their names were purposely wiped from the government papers. Their bodies were put into the ground in graves without markers all over the District of Columbia. For 200 years, the government insisted these missing details were not mistakes, but were actually the plan. In the year 1901, a repair team found something underneath the bottom of the east wing that caused the boss to stop all digging right away. The workers were made to promise they would not speak. The finding was buried again within a few hours. What they discovered showed that the first building work involved much more than just using people for hard labor. It pointed to a planned hiding of deaths that happened under conditions the young country could never afford to admit. Tonight, you will listen to what those papers really held. Before we go on with the tale of how America's biggest symbol was created on suffering that was hidden from history on purpose, I want to ask you a question. If you are listening from Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland, or anywhere inside the United States, write a comment telling us where you are from. These stories belong to every one of us, and knowing where our listeners are tuning in from makes this group even stronger. Now, sign up for Liturgy of Fear so you never miss the dark parts of American history they tried to hide. Let us find the truth together. The finding in 1901 would not be the last time a person found proof of what truly took place during those 8 years of building. But to see why those discoveries were so risky, you need to understand how the job started and who was really made to build it. Philadelphia was the country's capital in 1790, but the Residence Law passed that July said a new federal district must be along the Potomac River. President Washington himself picked the exact spot in January 1791, a 10-mile square cut from land given by Maryland and Virginia. The place was not the beautiful land shown in later pictures. It was wet, swampy land full of mosquitoes, extremely hot and sticky in the summer, and had only a few tobacco farms worked by enslaved people who had been farming that dirt for a long time. The leaders picked to watch over the building faced a problem right away. The federal government did not have any money. The whole project, including the president's house, the Capitol, office buildings, and roads, would cost about $400,000, which was a huge amount for a nation still deep in debt from the Revolutionary War. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson came up with an answer that seemed smart because it was simple. Hire enslaved workers. Their owners would get a rental fee, usually $5 a month for each enslaved person, while the workers themselves would get nothing except basic food and a place to sleep. This deal, Jefferson said in a letter from March 1792, would keep the costs low while making sure the work moves ahead without stopping or complaining. The main architect, James Hoban, an Irish newcomer who had drawn plans for several big buildings in Charleston, turned in plans for the President's house in July 1792. His ideas took a lot from Leinster House in Dublin, showing balance and a large size. When Washington looked at the plans, he demanded the building be even bigger, 1/5 larger than Hoban's first idea. This growth would need a lot more work, more supplies, and more time. The leaders sent notices all over Maryland and Virginia. Owners could rent out their enslaved workers to the federal building project. The pay was sure, and the government promised to send the workers back unhurt. That promise turned out to be empty. By November 1792, About 150 enslaved workers had been gathered at the building site. They came from farms all over the area, from Loudoun County, Charles County, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County. Their owners' names show up in the payment books: Daniel Carroll, Notley Young, Samuel Davidson, William Brent. But the workers themselves were listed in a different way. The books show only first names, sometimes not even that, just Negro man or Negro boy, followed by a guess at their age: Tom, age 23, Peter, age 19. A boy called Harry, maybe 14. A man named Len, who the papers suggest was over 50, too old for such hard work, but rented out anyway because his master needed the monthly money. The work started right away, even though winter was coming. The first job was clearing the land, taking down trees, drying out the swamp, and digging the bottom. This meant working waste, deep in freezing mud, using nothing but shovels, axes, and raw power. The letters from the leaders during that first winter mention small problems with the Negro labor due to the weather, but give no details about what those problems were. A note from December 14th, 1792 talks about swapping 3 workers who could not go on, without explaining why they could not go on or what happened to them. One worker who did leave a mark in the papers was a man named Isaac, rented from a farm owner named Samuel Hanson. Isaac was a good carpenter, one of several enslaved experts brought to the job because their skills were needed. The letters show Isaac worked on the inside wood parts through 1793 and 1794, and that Hanson got paid for Isaac's work through November 1794. Then Isaac's name vanishes from the books. No note of his return to Hanson's farm. No record of being sold or moved. Just gone from the papers as if he never was there. Another name that shows up a lot in early records is Peter Lennox, a stone worker enslaved by Martha Custis Peter, the Step, granddaughter of George Washington. Lennox was given the job of watching over stone cutting at the government quarry in Aquia, Virginia, where the cream-colored stone for the president's house was dug up. The quarry work was some of the most risky. Huge blocks of stone had to be cut, lifted, and moved without modern machines. A single slip could crush a man in a second. Lennox's name shows up in pay records through 1796, noted as good and skilled. After 1796, he also disappears from the papers. The leaders Thomas Johnson, Daniel Carroll, and David Stewart took turns in different jobs, but their letters show a constant worry about the project timeline. President Washington wanted the house done before his time in office ended in 1797. This pressure turned into very hard work schedules for the enslaved laborers. Letters between the leaders and Hoban talk about working from sunrise until dark when weather lets them, and using double crews on bottom work to meet dates. These short mentions hint at the truth. 60-hour days, 7 days a week during good weather with no pay other than small amounts of food. The living places were just as bad. The enslaved workers were put in temporary wooden huts near the building site, rough shelters that gave little safety from the weather. An expense note from March 1793 lists buying straw for Negro living areas, suggesting they slept on the dirt with only straw for a bed. Another note from August 1793 allows buying salt fish and cornmeal to feed Negro workers. The cheapest food possible, no meat, no vegetables, just enough to keep them working. Sickness was sure to happen. The swampy land created malaria, typhoid, and dysentery. The letters sometimes mentioned sickness among the workers, always described as a problem for the building schedule. A note from June 1793 complains that the flux has started among the Negro workers, cutting the workforce by almost a third. The flux or dysentery could kill in days if it was bad. The letter says nothing about fixing them or getting better, only about the weight it caused. Medical care for enslaved workers was very small. The leaders hired a doctor named William Thornton to look after workers, but his pay records show he was paid much less for treating enslaved workers than for treating free white workers. Even more telling, Thornton's bills show much fewer visits to enslaved workers, even though there were more of them. When an enslaved person got too sick to work, the most common answer was to send them back to their master and hire a new one. This habit left no paper trail of what happened to those who were sent back, whether they got better, whether they died, or whether they were sold to make up for the lost rental money. The Scottish stone worker Colin Williamson kept a better record than most. Williamson watched over much of the stonework and kept a diary that lasted in his family's papers until given to the Library of Congress in 1968. His notes from 1794 and 1795 give rare looks into the daily truth. The black men work the stone even with bleeding hands, he wrote in April 1794. They get no gloves, no proper tools for their hands, yet are expected to make the same quality as trained masons. Several have infections that should be cleaned. I mentioned this to the leader's helper, who said care would be given when time allowed. Time, it seems, never allows. Williamson's diary also tells of an event from July 1794 that does not show up in any government paper. Today, a platform fell on the south wall. 3 men fell, 2 of them Negroes. The white man was carried to the doctor right away. The 2 black men were left where they fell for nearly an hour before anyone helped them. One seems to have a broken back. I think he will not live, and if he does, he will never walk again. This bothers me a lot, but I am told this is not my business. The man with the likely broken back was probably a worker named Ben, enslaved by William Brent. Ben's name shows up in pay books through June 1794, then stops. Brent kept getting paid for Negro labor in July and August 1794, but the name changes to Negro Man Jim. This pattern, sudden name changes in the pay records without explanation, happens again and again during the building time, suggesting workers were being swapped. But the reasons for their leaving were hidden on purpose. By 1795, the building shell was mostly done, but inside work would take several more years. The job grew to include not just the president's house, but also the land around it, roads, and other buildings. This growth meant the number of workers actually got bigger during the last half of the decade. At its highest point in 1798, somewhere between 400 and 500 workers labored on the site and in related jobs like the quarries, brick ovens, and wood mills. Most were enslaved. The papers from this time get shorter and shorter about the enslaved workers. Earlier letters at least called them by groups: Negro carpenters, Negro laborers, Negro quarrymen. After 1795, the words become vague. Workers hired from area farms, contracted labor, servants. This change in words was not an accident. As the project became more famous and got public attention, the leaders became more careful about how they wrote down who was working. They understood even then that the appearance was bad. Here was the house of the president, the symbol of the new country, being built by people who had no freedom in that country. George Washington himself visited the building site many times through the 1790s. His diary notes about these visits focus on how the building looks and time concerns. He never once mentions the enslaved workers in these notes, even though they made up at least 70% of the group. This leaving out speaks loudly about how the founders chose to see or not see the work that built their institutions. The white workers on site, mostly newcomers from Ireland and Scotland, were paid real wages, usually $1 a day for skilled workers, 50 cents for regular laborers. They could leave if they wanted. They could complain about conditions. They had names in the records that included last names, places they came from, and family members. When they were hurt, they got medical care and money. When they died, they were buried in marked graves and their families were told. None of this was true for the enslaved workers. They had no choice, no voice, no help. They built the house stone by stone, brick by brick, knowing they would never walk through its doors as anything but servants, knowing their children would inherit their chains, knowing their names would be forgotten, while the names of the designers, leaders, and presidents would be written in history books. But some of them left marks anyway. Small, planned acts of being there that would only be found centuries later. In the spring of 1796, James Hoban reported a problem to the leaders. Several stone blocks being put into the north wall had strange marks. Shallow scratches that looked planned rather than accidental damage from digging or moving. Hoban's letter dated April 3, 1796, calls them crude symbols or letters, purpose unknown. He asked if the blocks should be changed or simply turned inward so the marks would not be seen. The reply, dated April 10th, tells Hoban to turn the stones inward and keep building. The marks are likely meaningless scratches from handling. The letter states, "There is no need to delay work for such small things." The event was considered closed, but the marks were not meaningless. They were names. Enslaved workers with stone-cutting skills had carved their names, or sometimes just initials, into blocks they had shaped. The carvings were small, easily ignored as accidental marks, unless you knew what to look for. They were acts of great bravery, because if caught while carving, the punishment would have been bad. But they did it anyway. These men, whose names appeared in books only as Tom or Peter or Negro Man, they carved TH and PL, and sometimes full names like Isaac into stone, then sent those stones to become forever parts of the president's house. It was their way of saying, "We were here, we built this, remember us." Hoban never reported finding more marked stones, which suggests either he stopped noticing or stopped reporting. Given the dismissive answer from the leaders, the second one seems more likely. Why bother the bosses with something they had already said didn't matter? The marked stones were not found again until 1902, during Theodore Roosevelt's repair of the building. Workers taking off plaster from inside walls found the stones with their carvings turned inward exactly as Hoban had been told to place them. The repair boss, a man named Charles McKim, made a note of the find in his private papers, found various stones with crude markings on inside faces. Some appear to be initials or names. Where they came from is unsure. Likely made by workers during first building, McKim's note suggests he understood the meaning, but no official report was ever filed. The stones stayed in place, hidden behind new plaster, but the marked stones were only a small part of what had been hidden on purpose. The more important hiding began in the summer of 1797, following an event that could have ruined the project's already weak reputation. July 1797 brought one of the worst heat waves anyone could recall. Temperatures went above 100 degrees for days. The mix of extreme heat, swamp humidity, and not enough water created terrible conditions for the workers. Within 2 weeks, dozens of enslaved laborers fell sick with what the letters call vague summer fevers. The leaders sent fast letters to farm owners. Your workers have taken sick and cannot go on. Send new ones. These letters are unusually many for late July and early August 1797. At least 23 survive in the files. Each asks for immediate replacement workers, which suggests the number of sick workers was more than 23, possibly by a lot. What happened to those workers? The papers contain no follow-up letters explaining their fate. The farm owner replies, where they exist are short, replacement sent, no mention of the sick workers being returned, no mention of them getting better or dying, nothing. Colin Williamson's diary notes from this time are scary. The sickness spreads through the Negro quarters like wildfire. He wrote on July 23, 1797, I have seen at least a dozen men too weak to stand, yet there is no doctor helping them. They lie in those bad huts burning with fever, and no one seems worried except to figure out when new workers will arrive. I asked the leader's man what plans have been made for care. He told me the sick ones have been moved to a separate area to stop the sickness spreading to the other workers. When I asked where this separate area was, he avoided the question and told me it was not my business. Williamson's note from July 28th is more troubling. I have learned where the sick are being kept. There is a hastily built shed near the old oven site, maybe a quarter mile from the main building. I walked there this morning despite being told to stay in my area. What I found troubles me deeply. At least 20 men lie in that shed with almost no care. One woman, a young girl, really cannot be more than 16, helps them as best she can with nothing but water and rags. The heat inside that shed is too much. Many of the men are clearly dying. I asked the boss about this cruel treatment and was told quite clearly that the leaders cannot afford to stop building for illness, that the sick will either get better or they won't, and that my job is stonework, not nursing. I feel ashamed to be part of this job. The young girl Williamson mentioned appears nowhere in official records. Enslaved women worked on the project too, mostly as cooks and washers, but their presence is barely written down. This girl may have been brought just to tend the sick, an enslaved person with nursing skills hired for a short time, and then returned to her master when the crisis passed or didn't pass. Williamson's final note on the subject, dated August 5, 1797, is chilling in its shortness. The shed near the oven is empty now, all of them. I asked what happened to the men who were there. I was told they had recovered and been sent back to their farms, but I saw no wagons arrive to move them. I saw no men walking or being helped away. The shed is simply empty and no one will speak of it. I suspect something terrible has happened, but I have no proof and no one to tell who would care. What happened to those sick workers? If they had truly recovered and been returned, there would be papers, letters from owners saying they returned, complaints about workers arriving weak, something. Instead, there is silence, a hole in the records where answers should be. One of the few surviving farm owner letters from this time gives a troubling hint. Samuel Hansen, the man who had hired out Isaac the carpenter, wrote to the leaders in September 1797, asking about 3 of his enslaved workers who had been sent to the project in June. "I have received payment for their labor through July," Hansen wrote, "but they have not been returned as I expected when I sent replacement workers in August. I would like to know where they are and when they might return, as I need them for harvest work." The reply, dated September 18, 1797, is frustratingly vague. "The workers you speak of were sick with summer illness and could not continue. Plans were made for their care. We will ask about their current situation and tell you." No follow-up letter exists to show whether they ever provided that information. Hansen's later letters contain no further mention of those 3 workers, which suggests either he got a private verbal answer or he gave up asking. But some owners didn't give up. In November 1797, William Brent sent a sharp letter to the leaders demanding the return of 5 enslaved workers who hadn't come back to his farm despite being replaced months earlier. "I have lost use of 5 able workers for which I continue to receive payment, yet the workers themselves have not returned. This deal cannot continue. I demand either the return of these workers or an explanation of why they cannot return along with money for their loss if they have died in federal service." This letter hit a nerve. The reply came within 3 days, unusually fast, and its tone was defensive. "The workers you speak of met with bad circumstances during their service. Death happened despite best efforts at treatment. We regret this result, but note that the work they were doing carried risks which were known when they were hired. Payment to you for their labor will stop as of November 1, 1797. No extra money can be provided." So at least 5 of Brent's workers had died. The leaders admitted it when forced to, but no details were given about how they died, where they were buried, or whether their families were told. The letter treats their deaths as an unfortunate but normal business matter. The workers died, the rental payment stopped, the matter was closed. How many others died? The admission regarding Brent's 5 workers suggests deaths happened, but were being hidden in the records on purpose. If deaths were mentioned only when an owner specifically demanded answers, how many deaths went entirely unreported because no one rich enough bothered to ask? The history writer who would later look at these documents, a man named Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, guessed in an 1882 private letter that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons likely died during the president's house building, though official records admit no such thing. Latrobe based this guess on holes in the payment books, sudden name changes, and the unusually high number of replacement workers asked for during certain times, mainly summer 1797. But even Latrobe's guess might be low. If 50 people died during 8 years of building with hundreds of workers employed, that would actually be a remarkably low death rate given the conditions. Other large building projects of the time, canals, forts, harbor works, regularly saw death rates of 10 to 15% among enslaved workers. If that rate applied to the president's house with an estimated 400 to 500 400 enslaved workers moving through the project, the death toll could have been 40 to 75 people. Where were they buried? This question leads to the find that the boss made in 1901, the one that caused an immediate stop to digging and promised secrecy among the workers. The repair project that year involved strengthening the east wing's bottom. Workers dug down to expose the original foundation stones laid in 1792. About 6 feet below the current ground level, they found bones, human bones, at least a dozen skulls, according to the boss's private notes, along with many other bones that appeared to have been buried fast and without ceremony. No boxes, no markers, just bones in the dirt beneath the building's bottom. The boss, a man named Henry Reed, immediately knew what this meant. If news spread that human remains had been found buried in unmarked graves beneath the White House, it would start investigations, questions, and potentially massive public scandal. Reed made a choice that afternoon. Bury the bones again exactly where they had been found, tell no one outside the work crew, and continue with the repair in a different area of the foundation. Reed kept a personal diary, which his family gave to the National Archives in 1978. His note from October 12, 1901, describes the find in detail. We found them roughly 6 feet down, just outside the original eastern foundation line. The bones were mixed together with no attempt at proper burial I could see. Some skulls showed damage consistent with being hit, though I am no doctor. We counted at least 12 skulls, possibly more, as some were broken pieces. The Negro workers on our crew became very quiet when we uncovered them. One old man, a fellow named Joseph, who has worked on the grounds for 40 years, said he had heard stories from his grandfather about workers buried near the house during the first building. He said his grandfather called them the Forgotten Ones. We buried everything again before the day ended. I told all workers that nothing was found and that anyone speaking of this find would be fired right away. I then moved the foundation work to the western side. I could not risk this becoming public knowledge. I admit I felt quite sick all evening thinking of those poor souls buried like trash beneath this great house. Reed never filed an official report about the find. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He simply ensured the bones remained hidden and took the secret to his grave in 1924. Only the discovery of his diary decades later revealed what had been found and buried again. The bones raised terrible questions. If enslaved workers had been buried right outside the foundation, had they died during building and been disposed of as quickly and quietly as possible? Were these some of the workers who vanished from the records in summer 1797? Were there more burial sites elsewhere on the grounds that had never been found? Reed's diary mentions that the bones showed damage consistent with trauma. This could mean many things: injuries from building accidents, the physical toll of hard labor, or even violence. The diary does not say more, and without proper science checks, which Reed refused to allow, the truth about how these people died would remain forever unknown. What is certain is that at least a dozen human beings were buried in unmarked graves on the White House grounds, and that this fact was hidden on purpose, not just in 1797, but again in 1901, when the proof was literally in hand. Someone decided both times that these deaths were better left unsaid, but the question of who made that decision in 1797, and whether the deaths were truly accidents or something worse, would haunt the project's later history. The president's house wasn't finished until November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to live in it. By then, most of the enslaved workers who had built it had been returned to their farms, scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their part in creating the building was already being written out of the official story. The leader's final report on the project, submitted in December 1800, is a masterwork of leaving things out. It details every building feature, every cost, every challenge beat. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks the skilled experts who brought the building to life. It never once mentions that most of those experts were enslaved people who got no pay, no credit, and in some cases no burial. Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801 after his swearing in. Jefferson brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, laborers to keep up the grounds. For Jefferson, the presence of enslaved people in the building wasn't strange or opposite. It was simply the way things were. He wrote beautifully about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, and he never seemed to understand the deep clash in this setup. The building became known as the White House decades later, though the start of that name is argued. Some say it came from the white paint used to cover the sandstone walls after British troops burned the building in 1814. Others claim it was always called that because of the natural color of the stone. Either way, the name stuck, and with it, a myth about the building's creation that was almost entirely false. Official White House histories written throughout the 19th century barely mentioned the enslaved workforce. When they did admit their existence, it was with soft language like servants, workers from local farms, or contracted labor. The hint was always that these were normal employees doing normal work for normal pay. The fact that they were enslaved, that they had no choice, that they got nothing, all of this was smoothed over, cleaned up, made invisible. Even histories that admitted slavery's role in building minimized it. An 1831 guidebook to Washington described the building as put up by skilled experts and laborers brought together through the federal leaders' hard work. Technically true, but brought together makes it sound like a willing team rather than forced labor. The guidebook's author, a man named Jonathan Elliott, certainly knew the truth. He had studied the leaders' papers, but he chose language that wouldn't disturb readers' patriotic pride in the building. This pattern of choosing what to remember continued through the century when major repairs happened in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1860s. Newspapers covered them a lot, but never thought to investigate who had built the original structure or under what conditions. When presidents gave tours and speeches about the house's history, they spoke of design influences from Irish and Scottish traditions, but never mentioned the African hands that actually built the walls. Some people knew the truth, though. They just didn't have ways to share it. Among the enslaved community in Washington and nearby areas, the story of the building's construction was passed down through generations. Elderly people who had worked on the project told their children and grandchildren what it had really been like. They described the heat, the sickness, the friends who vanished and never returned. They talked about the bones buried on the grounds, the marked stones hidden in the walls, the names that no one would remember. One of these stories was kept in a special document found in 1978. Among papers given to Howard University was a handwritten story by a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819. Robertson's grandfather, Thomas, had worked on the President's House building in the 1790s. She wrote down his stories as he told them to her in the 1840s, creating one of the only direct accounts of what the work was actually like. Thomas's stories filtered through his granddaughter's memory and writing paint a picture that is far darker than any official history. Grandpa Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs couldn't straighten. He said the white bosses didn't see them as men, but as tools like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends in the night when no one was watching, said prayers over them that nobody wrote down. He said his friend Peter carved his name in a stone and told Thomas, "They will forget us, but the stone will remember long after we are gone. Our names will be in those walls even if nobody can see them." Grandpa cried when he told me that. He said Peter never came home from the work, said he got sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Celia Robertson's account continues with stories of her grandfather's pain from the experience. He had bad dreams about the house for the rest of his life. She wrote he would wake up shaking, saying he could still hear the sounds of men dying in that shed where they put the sick ones. He said he tried to help them, tried to bring them water, but the bosses wouldn't let him near. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, for their wives, for water, for mercy. He said the sound stopped after a few days, and then the shed was empty, and nobody would say what happened to those men. Thomas also described the event that left several workers dead from a platform falling, confirming Colin Williamson's diary entry. Grandpa said he saw the platform break and 3 men fall, 1 white man and 2 colored. The white man was carried away and helped immediately. The 2 colored men lay there broken on the ground for near an hour before anybody even looked at them. One man had his leg twisted wrong and kept screaming. The other wasn't moving at all. Finally, they carried them both to the shed. He never saw either of them again. Robertson's document wasn't publicly known until it was found among Howard University's files and written about in a small school journal in 1982. Even then, it received little attention. The main history group largely ignored it, perhaps because it went against the more comfortable story about the building's starts that had been set over nearly 2 centuries. But the document raised important questions. If Thomas's memories were right, and there is no reason to think his granddaughter made them up, then the official record had deliberately hidden numerous deaths and terrible working conditions. The shed where they put the sick ones matched the spot Colin Williamson described in his diary. The platform event matched Williamson's account almost perfectly. Thomas's stories and Williamson's notes from the time were backing each other up across decades. This meeting of proof suggested something historians had long suspected, but could never quite prove. The President's House building involved significant loss of enslaved lives, and those losses were systematically erased from the historical record. The physical proof supported this conclusion too. In 1978, the same year Robertson's account was found, a team of diggers did a survey of the White House grounds as part of a big history project. The survey included ground radar checks of areas that had never been built on or much disturbed since the 1790s. The radar showed shapes consistent with unmarked graves in at least 3 spots on the grounds. One site was very close to where Henry Reed's crew had found bones in 1901. Another was near the old oven site that Williamson had mentioned in his diary. The third was in an area that is now part of the Rose Garden. The diggers noted these findings in their technical report, but said not to dig. Given the political touchiness of potentially finding human remains on the White House grounds, the report stated, and the fact that any such remains would likely be enslaved individuals buried without ceremony or record, we suggest these sites be left alone and marked as potentially sensitive areas for future reference. In other words, we know there are probably bodies buried here, but digging them up would be politically hard, so let's just note it and move on. This choice, like Henry Reed's choice in 1901 and the leaders' choices in the 1790s, put the institution's name over historical truth and human dignity. The people buried in those unmarked graves had been forgotten in death just as they had been used in life. Even when proof of their existence surfaced, the response was to bury it again, literally or in words. The history writer who had guessed 30 to 50 deaths, Benjamin Latrobe Jr., became focused on finding the true number. After looking at the surviving leaders' papers in the 1880s, Latrobe began writing to elderly African Americans in the Washington area, trying to collect spoken histories before that generation passed away. He managed to record accounts from 17 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the president's house building. Their stories were remarkably consistent. All mentioned brutal working conditions, not enough food and water, constant sickness, and people who vanished from the workforce and were never heard from again. Several specifically mentioned the summer of 1797 as particularly deadly. One man told Latrobe, "My grandmother said her uncle went to work on the president's building and caught the fever that summer when it was so hot. She said they took him to a place away from the others, and her mother went looking for him but couldn't find where they had put him. Later they told her he had died and been buried, but they wouldn't say where. She looked for his grave for years, but never found it." Latrobe put these accounts into a book he hoped to print as a fix to the clean histories. He titled it The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings, but no publisher would touch it. Latrobe tried for 5 years to get the book printed, but the rejections were all the same: too controversial, not right for current readers, lacks enough proof, and most telling, would hurt the name of respected institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, bitter and frustrated. His book remained unprinted until 1934, when a small school press released it in a run of just 500 copies. It sold poorly and quickly went out of print. The book is now extremely rare. Most copies were lost or destroyed over the years. Only about 24 copies are known to exist today, scattered among university libraries and private collections. Even when the truth was written down and available, it couldn't gain traction against the set story. The myth of the White House as a symbol of democratic ideals and American values was too powerful, too important to national identity. Admitting that it had been built on the backs of enslaved people who died unmarked and forgotten. That admission would require facing uncomfortable truths about the nation's founding that most Americans weren't ready to face. So, the truth remained buried, quite literally in some cases, beneath decades and then centuries of silence. The president's house wasn't finished until November 1800, when John Adams became the first president to live in it. By then, most of the enslaved workers who had built it had been returned to their farms scattered across Maryland and Virginia. Their role in creating the building already being written out of the official story. The leader's final report on the project submitted in December 1800 is a masterwork of leaving things out. It details every building feature, every cost, every challenge beat. It praises James Hoban's design and George Washington's vision. It thanks the skilled experts who brought the building to life. It never once mentions that most of those experts were enslaved people who got no pay, no credit, and in some cases no burial. Thomas Jefferson moved into the house in March 1801 after his swearing in. Jefferson brought his own enslaved workers from Monticello, cooks, servants, laborers to keep up the grounds. For Jefferson, the presence of enslaved people in the building wasn't strange or opposite. It was simply the way things were. He wrote beautifully about liberty while surrounded by people who had none, and he never seemed to understand the deep clash in this setup. Among the enslaved community in Washington and nearby areas, the story of the building's construction was passed down through whispered talks and quiet warnings. Elderly people who had worked on the project told their children what it had really been like. They described the heat, the sickness, the friends who disappeared and never returned. They talked about the bones buried somewhere on the grounds, the marked stones hidden in the walls, the names that no one would remember. One such story survived in a special way. In 1843, a woman named Celia Robertson, born into slavery in 1819, began writing down her grandfather Thomas' stories about working on the president's house in the 1790s. She kept these writings hidden, knowing that enslaved people caught with written things could face bad punishment. Her account, kept safe secretly and passed down through her family, would remain unknown to historians for generations. Thomas's stories, filtered through his granddaughter's careful memory and secret writing, painted a picture far darker than any official history. Grandpa Thomas said they worked until their hands bled and their backs couldn't straighten. He said the white bosses didn't see them as men but as tools like the hammers and saws. When a tool broke, you got another. When a man fell, you got another man. He said they buried friends in the night when no one was watching. Said prayers over them that nobody wrote down. The account continued with stories that matched details from other sources. He said his friend Peter carved his name in a stone and told Thomas, "They will forget us, but the stone will remember. Long after we are gone, our names will be in those walls, even if nobody can see them." Grandpa cried when he told me that. He said Peter never came home from the work, said he got sick one summer and they took him away, and that was the last anyone saw of him. Thomas also described the shed near the oven where sick workers were taken during that terrible summer of 1797. Grandpa said he tried to help them, tried to bring them water, but the bosses wouldn't let him near. He said you could hear them calling out for their mothers, for their wives, for water, for mercy. He said the sound stopped after a few days, and then the shed was empty, and nobody would say what happened to those men. He had bad dreams about it until the day he died. If you are finding this story as troubling as it truly is, take a moment to like this video and leave a comment with your thoughts. What do you think happened to those men in that shed? The ideas and talks in the comments help us all understand these dark chapters of history together. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because stories like this need to be told and remembered. Celia Robertson's account remained hidden in her family for decades after her death in 1889. By then, Official histories of the president's house had already hardened into a comfortable myth that barely acknowledged enslaved labor at all. An 1831 guidebook described the building as put up by skilled experts and laborers brought together through the federal leaders' hard work. The phrase "brought together" made forced labor sound like a willing team. Meanwhile, occasional proof would surface that went against the clean story, only to be quickly buried again. In 1867, during Andrew Johnson's presidency, Workers Fixing Foundation damage from decades of settling found several items that had clearly been left by 18th century laborers. Among them was a small wooden circle about 2 inches wide with careful carving on both sides. One side had the initials PL. The other side had what appeared to be a date, 1796. The fix-up boss recognized this might be important and reported it to the White House steward. The steward examined the circle, noted it in his daily log, as curious item found during repair work, appears old, and placed it in a storage cabinet. No further check was done. The circle sat forgotten in that cabinet, while the man whose initials were carved on it, likely Peter Lennox, remained as forgotten as he had been for 70 years. That same year, something else was found that the White House steward did not record in his official log, though he mentioned it in a private letter to his brother, dated September 14th, 1867. During foundation repairs this month, the workers uncovered what looked like human remains in the soil near the eastern wall. Old bones, several skulls. The workers became quite upset, especially the colored men on the crew. I talked with the president's secretary about what should be done. We agreed the matter was best handled quietly. The bones were buried again in the same spot, and the repair work continued in a different area. I suspect these were workers who died during the first building and were buried hastily on the grounds. But raising questions about this now would serve no good purpose and might cause unneeded scandal. The steward's decision to bury the bones again and stay silent set a pattern that would be followed again decades later. The dead would stay buried. The questions would stay unasked. In 1891, the Interior Department hired a history writer named Herbert Bancroft to write a full history of federal buildings. Bancroft was given access to files that previous writers had never seen, including letters between the leaders and farm owners that had been stored in a War Department warehouse and largely forgotten. What Bancroft found in those yellowed letters bothered him deeply. He found the exchange between William Brent and the leaders in which they admitted 5 of Brent's workers had died. He found at least a dozen similar exchanges with other farm owners. He found records of payment fights where owners demanded money for workers who hadn't been returned. He found medical bills that suggested far more workers had needed treatment than the leaders had admitted publicly. Most disturbing was a letter he found from Samuel Davidson to his brother, dated December 1797, that had apparently never been sent. Davidson had written it in clear anger. I have received notice from the federal leaders that 3 of my workers have died while in their service this past summer. They died in July supposedly of fever, though no doctor checked them as far as I can tell. Brother, these were healthy, strong men I sent to Washington in June. 3 months later, all 3 are dead, and I am told this is simply bad luck. I do not believe it was luck at all. I believe conditions at that building site are cruel. The bosses are mean and careless, and men are dying from abuse as much as from any fever." The letter continued with a claim that made Bancroft stop and read it twice. "I have spoken with other owners who sent workers to that cursed project. William Brent lost 5 men, and was told nothing until he demanded answers. I spoke with Notley Young, who said at least a dozen of his workers came back sick and weak, and 3 died within weeks of returning home. The true toll of this building is far higher than anyone will admit. I will not send another living soul to work on federal projects." Bancroft sat in that file room for a long time after reading Davidson's letter. If the farm owner's information was correct, and Bancroft had found papers confirming Brent's 5 deaths, then at least 24 enslaved workers had died that Davidson knew about. And Davidson plainly stated, "The true toll is far higher than anyone will admit." Bancroft put his findings into a section of his book titled "The Human Cost of Construction." He wrote carefully but honestly about what the records showed. The building of the President's house, that great symbol of American democracy, was done in large part through the forced labor of enslaved persons. The conditions under which they worked were brutal. The pay they got was nothing, and the deaths that happened, deaths which available proof suggests numbered at least 40 individuals and quite possibly more, were deliberately hidden in official records and have been left out of all later histories of the building. When Bancroft turned in his draft book to the Interior Department in early 1892, the response came fast. A letter dated March 3, 1892 told him clearly, "While we appreciate your deep research, we feel that the section regarding unfortunate events during building does not serve the purpose of this hired history, which is to celebrate the building and engineering wins of our federal buildings. Please remove this section entirely and focus on the positive parts of these great American landmarks." Bancroft argued. He wrote back, saying that a complete history must include uncomfortable truths, that leaving out the deaths and suffering of enslaved workers was bad for historical truth and to the memory of those who died. The Interior Department's reply was even more direct. Remove the section or the book would not be printed and he would not be paid. Bancroft had spent 2 years on the project. He had a family to support. He removed the section, but he couldn't bring himself to destroy it. He kept the cut pages among his personal papers along with copies of the most damaging letters he'd found. He wrote a note on the folder holding them. "The truth about how the President's house was built, removed from my history at government demand. May someone braver than I eventually tell this story. H.B. April 1892. The printed version of Bancroft's history appeared in 1893. It contained exactly 1 paragraph about enslaved labor. The project employed workers from area plantations under contract with their masters, a common habit of the time. These workers gave their skills to the building of this beautiful structure." Bancroft's deleted section with its careful proof of deaths, its quotes from Davidson's angry letter, its guess of 40 or more dead, remained in his personal files. When Bancroft died in 1918, his papers were stored in boxes by his family who didn't know what historical importance they held. The history writer Benjamin Latrobe Jr., son of the famous architect, had spent years in the 1880s trying to piece together the truth about the President's house building. He had reviewed what records he could access. He had interviewed elderly African Americans whose grandparents or great-grandparents had worked on the project. He had collected 17 spoken histories, all consistent in describing brutal conditions, constant sickness, and people who vanished and never returned. Latrobe put everything into a book he titled The Hidden Cost: Enslaved Labor in the Construction of Federal Buildings. He guessed based on holes in payment records and the spoken histories he'd collected that between 30 and 50 enslaved persons had likely died during the president's house building. For 5 years, Latrobe tried to find a publisher. Every response was the same: too controversial, not right for current readers, lacks enough proof, and most telling, would hurt the name of respected institutions. Latrobe died in 1887, his book unprinted. His papers were given to a university library where they sat unlisted and unread in boxes marked simply Latrobe Architectural Notes. The truth was available. It was written down. It was in files and family papers and university collections, but it couldn't gain traction against the set story. The myth of the White House as a pure symbol of American ideals was too important, too central to national identity, admitting it had been built on the backs of enslaved people who died and were forgotten. That admission would require facing truths that most Americans in the late 19th century weren't willing to face. In October 1901, the find that Henry Reed's crew made beneath the East Wing Foundation brought all of these buried truths rushing back to the surface, at least for the few people who knew about it. The repair project that fall involved strengthening foundations that had settled over a century. Workers dug down to expose the original stones laid in 1792. At roughly 6 feet below the current ground level, a worker's shovel hit something that wasn't stone or soil. He called his foreman over. They dug more carefully. Bones, human bones, a skull, then another, then more. The foreman immediately stopped the crew and sent for Superintendent Henry Reed. Reed arrived within the hour and looked at what they had uncovered. At least a dozen skulls were visible, along with many other bones that appeared to have been buried fast without ceremony. No boxes, no markers, no items. Just human remains left in the dirt beneath the building's bottom. Reed was 53 years old and had worked on big buildings throughout Washington for 30 years. He understood immediately what he was looking at and what it meant. He also understood that if this find became public knowledge, it would start questions that would lead to investigations that would uncover the history that had been so carefully buried for a century. He made his choice within an hour. The crew would bury everything again exactly where it had been found. They would tell no one. They would move the foundation work to the western side of the building. And every worker on the crew would be told that talking about this find with anyone would result in immediate firing. The Negro workers on the crew had become very quiet when the bones were uncovered. One older man, a laborer named Joseph, who had worked on the White House grounds for 40 years, approached Reed as the reburial was taking place. "Sir," Joseph said quietly, "my father worked on building this house back in the old days. He told stories before he died." He said, "There were men buried near the house, workers who died, and nobody wanted to make a fuss about it. He called them the forgotten ones." Reed looked at the old man. "Did your grandfather say how many?" "He didn't know for certain, sir, but he said it was more than a few. He said there was a bad summer, terrible hot, and a lot of men got sick. He said they took the sick ones away to a shed somewhere, and after a while you didn't hear them anymore. He said folks knew they had died, but nobody would say it plain, just buried them quiet and kept working. Reed nodded slowly. Thank you for telling me that, Joseph. But this discovery, what we found today, it doesn't leave this work site. You understand? Yes, sir, I understand. Joseph paused. But those men deserve better than being buried twice with no one knowing. I know they do, Reed said, but that's not a decision I can make. That evening, Reed sat in his room at a boarding house near the White House and wrote in his personal diary, "We found them today, at least 12 skulls, possibly more, buried roughly outside the original eastern foundation. No boxes, no markers, no dignity. Some skulls showed damage that might be from being hit, though I'm no expert. Joseph, one of our Negro workers, said his grandfather told stories about workers buried near the house during building. He called them the Forgotten Ones, an apt name. We buried everything again this afternoon. I've told the crew that anyone who speaks of this will be fired immediately. I've moved the foundation work to the west side. This discovery cannot become public knowledge, but I admit I felt quite sick all evening thinking of those souls buried like trash beneath this great symbol of our republic." Reed never filed an official report. He never told the president's staff or the Interior Department. He kept the secret until his death 23 years later, and only his private diary, which his family kept but never read carefully, preserved any record of what had been found. The bones that Reed and his crew buried again that October afternoon in 1901 remained in the ground, as forgotten in the 20th century as they had been in the 18th. The men they belonged to, some of whom were probably listed on the paper hidden in the foundation, some of whom had carved their names in stones now hidden behind plaster, stayed nameless and unmourned. But the discovery raised questions that Reed couldn't help but think about, even though he had never asked them aloud. If at least 12 people were buried right outside the eastern foundation, how many more were buried elsewhere on the grounds? The property covered 18 acres. Were there other burial sites that had never been disturbed? How many people had really died building this house? Reed thought about Joseph's grandfather's story of the shed where sick workers were taken that terrible summer. He thought about the skulls with trauma damage. He thought about the fact that no official records admitted any of this. Someone in 1797 had decided these deaths weren't worth writing down. Someone in 1867 had decided bones found during repairs should be quietly buried again. And now Reed himself had made the same choice in 1901. The pattern was clear. The dead would stay buried. The truth would stay hidden. And the comfortable myth about the building would remain untouched. The following spring, in March 1902, workmen were removing old plaster from inside walls during repair work when they found something that James Hoban had written about back in 1796. Behind the plaster, on stones that had been turned inward so their carved faces wouldn't be visible, were shallow scratches that weren't random at all. They were names, initials, small deliberate marks carved by the people who had shaped the stones. One worker noticed a stone with clear letters TH, another had PL, a third showed what looked like Isaac, carved carefully into the cream-colored stone. The workmen called over their boss, who looked at the marks and then ordered the workers to replace the plaster immediately and not discuss what they had found. But one worker, a young man named Timothy O'Brien, made a drawing of 3 of the carved stones before the plaster was replaced. He wrote in his own diary that evening, "Found names carved in the stones today. Old James, the colored man who works in the basement, says those were likely enslaved men who built this place. He says they carved their names so they wouldn't be forgotten. Boss told us to cover them back up and not talk about it. Seems wrong leaving those names hidden, but I suppose that's how it's always been. O'Brien's drawing showed 3 sets of marks: T on one stone, PL on another, Isaac on a third. Peter Lennox Thomas Isaac. Names that appeared in the leader's payment books a century earlier, now found again, carved in stone and immediately hidden again. The plaster was replaced that afternoon. The names were covered once more. The workers moved on to other walls, other repairs. Within a week, everyone had stopped thinking about the carved stones, if they had thought about them at all. Theodore Roosevelt, who lived in the White House during these repairs, was never told about the bones found the previous year or the carved names found that spring. The information was deemed unimportant to the president's concerns. Superintendent Reed had kept his silence, and the repair bosses saw no reason to break it. By the summer of 1902, all the repair work was done. The White House looked beautiful. Its structure strengthened, its rooms refreshed. Visitors admired the building's beauty and historical importance. Tour guides told stories about the architecture, the presidents who had lived there, the important decisions made within its walls. No one mentioned the bones buried on the grounds. No one spoke of the names hidden in the walls. No one admitted the price that had been paid to build this symbol of American democracy. In farm communities throughout Maryland and Virginia, elderly people still told stories about grandparents or great-grandparents who had worked on the president's house building and never came home. These stories were passed down through generations, kept in African-American families even as they vanished from official history. But by 1902, most of those elderly storytellers had died. Their children remembered some of the stories, but the details grew vague with each generation. Names were forgotten, specific events blurred together. The truth became harder to tell apart from additions or confusion. Celia Robertson had died in 1889, and her carefully hidden writings about her grandfather Thomas's experiences remained hidden away, unknown to anyone outside her close family. Herbert Bancroft's deleted book section sat in a box in his study. Benjamin Latrobe Jr.'s unprinted book gathered dust in a university storage room. The White House steward's 1867 letter to his brother about finding bones had been thrown out after his brother's death. Henry Reed's diary sat on a shelf in his bedroom, unread by anyone. The truth existed, scattered across dozens of documents and memories and hidden items, but scattered truth is invisible truth. Without someone to gather the pieces, to insist they mattered, to force the uncomfortable questions, the truth might as well not exist at all. The president's house stood shining in the Washington sun, arguably the most famous building in America. Visitors from across the country came to admire it. School children learned about its history. Artists painted it. Photographers took pictures of it. Politicians worked inside it. And beneath their feet, in unmarked graves scattered across the grounds, lay at least a dozen people who had built the foundation those visitors walked upon. No one knew their names. No one knew exactly where they were buried. No one knew exactly how they died or how many others had died with them. The questions that should have been asked in 1797 were never asked. The checks that should have happened in 1867 or 1891 or 1901 never occurred. The credit that should have been given was never offered. The carved names stayed hidden behind plaster. The bones stayed buried in the earth. The papers stayed scattered and unread in various files and private collections. And the comfortable myth that the president's house had been built by skilled experts working under normal circumstances remained undisturbed. In the Negro neighborhoods of Washington, some people still knew different. Old folks would point toward the White House and say, "My people built that, built it with their own hands, and got nothing for it. Some of them died building it and got buried right there on the grounds. But you won't read about that in any book." Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren heard these claims but didn't always believe them. The stories seemed too painful, too blaming against the nation's greatest symbol. Surely, if enslaved people had built the White House and died in the process, that would be in the history books. Surely, the government would admit something that important. But it wasn't in the history books. The government didn't admit it. The stories were true, but they existed only in spoken tradition among the descendants of the enslaved, while the written history told a different, cleaner tale. This is how truth dies, not in one big suppression, but in 1,000 small decisions to look away, to stay silent, to put comfort over honesty. Herbert Bancroft removing his section rather than losing his pay. Henry Reid burying the bones again rather than creating scandal. Repair bosses ordering plaster replaced over carved names rather than admitting their importance. Each decision seemed reasonable alone. Each person who chose silence had understandable reasons. But the pile of all those reasonable decisions meant that people who had built the White House with their own hands, who had died in the process, who had carved their names in stone, hoping to be remembered, those people were forgotten anyway. The White House still stands more than a century after those bones were found and buried again. It stands on foundations laid by people whose names were wiped from history. It was built with labor that was never paid for, never admitted, never honored. And for generations after 1902, the comfortable myth lasted because the truth had been buried too many times, too deeply by too many people who chose not to see it. This mystery shows us how historical truth can be slowly erased through seemingly reasonable decisions, how institutional silence can be more powerful than active censorship, and how people can build the most famous symbols while remaining totally invisible themselves. It shows us that the cost of keeping comfortable myths is often paid by those who have no voice to protest, no power to demand remembrance, no way to make history admit they existed. What do you think happened to all those workers whose names vanished from the records? How many do you think really died? Leave your comment below with your ideas. If you found this story as haunting as it truly is, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who needs to hear these forgotten stories. See you in the next video.